Gin Wigmore then, and Hallelujah was the name of that track. And right now I do have a Lewis Tillett with me. He has entered the building and is sitting here in the studio with me. And before I talk to him, we will play a track from the album that we are going to discuss today, Midnight Rain, and this track is Summer.
Spend my Saturday nights alone. Nothing to do, just sit at home. This town's getting dead, nowhere to go. They close the dance, she don't seem to show. Summer is coming again. Summer with me and my friends. Summer, the date and the beach. Summer within my reach. Summer has gone and I'm all alone. I think I'll just go on back home. This town's getting deader than before. No place to go and I'm all alone. Summer is coming again. Summer with me and my friends. Summer, the date and the beach. Summer within my reach. Summer is coming again. Summer with me and my friends. Summer, a date in the beach. Summer within my reach. Summer is coming again. Summer with me and my friends. The date in the beach. Summer within my
A track called Summer from Lewis Tillett's fifth solo album, Midnight Rain. Lewis is with me now to continue the journey of his music and life experience. Welcome, Lewis.
Once again, thank you.
Where were you when you wrote that song? That's a lovely song.
Yeah, it's I mean, where I was physically, it was once again Greece, but it's reminiscent of it's got a sort of, to me, it's melancholic, but a certain sort of beauty about it, and it's reminiscent, sort of naive, almost adolescent, but it was from a time when I first decided that school was not for me, and I went to stay with an uncle on the far north coast of New South Wales, and extremely isolated, moved into a little caravan, but I used to spend endless hours for days on end of wandering up and down the beach. Just I wasn't playing music, and I hadn't really started playing music back then, other than my school stuff and my classical training. But I used to love writing poetry and words, and I would write literally a kilometre of poetry along the beach at low tide, and just watch the waves come in and take it back, all the poetry back out to sea. So
Wow.
that's what that song's about.
Right, okay. Well, the album that we're discussing today is Midnight Rain. It was released in 1995, and it's the second Return to Sender release, with the previous one being The Ugly Truth, released in 1993, and which we talked about last week. So by now you're pretty much spending most of your time in Europe, where you feel your musical talent is appreciated and a loyalty from those who do.
Yeah, and this, it would have stayed in Europe, but because Charlie Owen, who played on the record as well, brought that record back to Australia and actually organised a release through one of the major labels, Polydor, Polygram. I get confused with them all. You know, and they're here one day, gone the next. Maybe it was Red Eye. Red Eye maybe, and I think Red Eye was bought out by Polydor, or who knows. But Charlie got an Australian release, which was good and bad. Bad because I mean they're a limited edition copy only for mail order, but instead it was remastered because all of these ugly Return to Sender albums were never actually mastered. So it was mastered, and the previous album, The Ugly Truth, was put in as a bonus disc in the Australian release. And I remember that CD got Rolling Stone's Critics of the Year album #1 choice, and it was interesting with the second bonus CD in there. It was so well hidden that for years I didn't even know there was one in there myself.
Really?
Until I opened it up and wondered what this. Oh, this is The Ugly Truth is in there as well.
Oh, for goodness sake! Wow.
But what it did do was through Charlie, it brought what I was doing in Europe back home to Australia, and it did get a national release here. And Charlie and I went on to do a lot of touring together as a duet. I think mentioned last week that we'd had this idea of trying with just two people to sound like the largest band imaginable, and also to in a complimentary way to at the end of a set have people in silence, no one to clap, and that happened on many occasions, and people just almost felt it was an insult to make a noise to detract from the music that had just been played. So it was a wonderful accomplishment.
Spellbound.
Yeah, very much. That was the idea of it.
Yes. Return to Sender is a mail order only division of your then Bonn record label in Germany.
Yes.
And as you just sort of touched on, then these last two albums were limited editions. So how did those go as far as orders?
It was good because the people were still getting more and more interested in something more intimate, something more personal, something that seemed to bring them a little closer to who I was musically and personally. And it seemed to fulfill a desire that many of the listeners had to know in an intimate way a bit more about my music. And so rather than not that I consider any of my albums being overproduced in any way or form, but by putting together a pretty much recorded in 1 or 2 days album, let them know how I played, what I sounded like, and again there was still this almost schism, an ideological difference between Europe and Australia, and this Midnight Rain being released in Australia sort of certainly didn't bridge that schism, but it made people a little more aware that there was more to what I was doing than what people generally thought. Right.
So it's 1995, which makes you 36.
Yeah.
And so up to this point, the only thing that has got you through your life to this age is your music. And for reasons unknown to you, life has dealt you a terrible blow at the very early age, affecting your mental state as you journey through life. So how has your life and state of mind progressed by 1995?
Sad to say, but going from bad to worse. It really was. And I was still playing. I over the next couple of years, I did a couple of tours with Tex Don and Charlie, and one with Tex Perkins' solo efforts after the Cruel Sea. I did a lot of really hard yards, very small, gutter pub gigs. And, it's one of those funny things, and as I've just found out recently through a dreadful Supreme Court battle, I was also been taken of advantage financially in a huge way, which I didn't know at the time, and all of that information sort of has actually come to light in the last year or two, and so. But
just
again,
when you thought your troubles were just about over.
Yeah. So it's funny that you mentioned 95, because the Supreme Court thing was between 95 and 97, and some people claiming how much they were doing to help me, and all I can say is that people who knew me then, it's no exaggeration to say that my life was a daily proposition. I had some dreadful accidents. I'd fallen through a glass window, and I don't mean cut myself, completely lacerated myself. Fortunately, there was someone in the house who was able to get a couple of ambulances there that had enough blood plasma. I was on heavy doses of crippling old-fashioned antipsychotic medication. Basically got a burn on my thigh that went right down basically to the muscle.
How did that happen?
Basically by alcohol and the medication rendered me. I mean, probably would have killed anyone else. I just seem to have some strange constitution that expels these chemicals out of my system before they can do me in. But I was basically anaesthetised to the point where basically a cigarette butt burning on nylon tracksuit pants on my thigh just kept burning and burning and burning. And yet, interestingly enough, and the story goes on, and I mean, I was spending probably a third of each year in psychiatric hospitals. I don't know whether I mentioned, I think I did actually, when we went back to Letters to a Dream, a lot of it was on day release from a psychiatric hospital.
Right.
And despite all this, the Supreme Court founding said that on one particular day that Lewis signed this contract, he was feeling very well and there was nothing wrong with him, despite a life history of, so it's just one of those things. But it was interesting to find out the truth, and it's as they say, in the next life we have justice, in this life we have only the law. So.
Goodness me, Lewis. The story goes on, and we're only up to 1995.
Oh, yeah.
Now, so all of your albums were actually recorded in Australia. So you were doing a fair bit of crisscrossing of the oceans. I know that you have very positive things to say about many of the medical staff that were treating you for your mental illness here in Australia. So how did your toing and froing affect your treatment?
I was also fortunate to have a wonderful psychiatrist in Athens, but the grueling nature of the tours was made it very, very difficult, and because the actual payment for the airfare may not have come through till 2 days before, so the stress of wondering whether it's even on. The flight over there was, the milk run, the cheapest ones, which is often a 50-hour flight. By the time it stops at all these obscure places, 50-hour flight, get off the plane, taken straight to the hotel, straight to interviews, sound check, perform, happy to be here, and you're there on your own in a foreign country, and it's you and what you do is up to you. Extremely exhausting. So tiredness was a big effect, but I do remember one of the a comment from when I was being discharged from a psychiatric hospital the day that I was flying out of the country, and I felt that I was going a little too soon, but I had to go, and I remember this wonderful nurse there, Marcia, who she said, "Well, how are you feeling this morning, Lewis?" It was very early; it was 6 o'clock, something like that. And I said, dreadful. I said, do you realise in 2 days' time I'm going to be in Vienna? I said, well, life's really tough, isn't it, Lewis? In 2 days' time I'm going to be in Marrickville. So didn't.
Was it any consolation?
It was, because she had a real sort of gallows sense of humour, and that was great. But there's the touring aspect of it is anything but glamorous. It's forever waiting. The CIA don't have sleep deprivation torture for nothing. It really does interfere with your mind, and the anxiety of being often on stage on your own, and then to have to give it all, and then do it again the next day, long drives, and then with no feedback. When it's finished, you're gone.
Right.
So it seems like a strange dream.
Yes.
Did I ever really go?
Yeah. Well, jet lag in itself is bad enough, isn't it? Without all the other pressures and goings on. Yeah. Now, that was sort of the last thing I had down to ask you about. So before we move on to what we're going to talk about next week, what else would you like to sort of talk about this album, Midnight Rain?
I think it was the culmination of what Charlie and I really tried to achieve, and I'm very, very proud of it, and proud of what we did, and I think it's a tremendous record. Again, I don't think there's another record like it. Many of our live performances, I believe, were wonderful, and again, this idea of stripping back, becoming more and more minimalist, and yet becoming more minimalist and yet more powerful, was an achievement. Every record has been a trial by fire, and as we've talked about many times, it's been the only thing that's kept me going. And so, why do I keep making these records? Well, basically, I couldn't live with myself if I didn't.
And what about the writing of songs? I mean, how do you go about that? Is it something you might sit down and do in one hit, or is
very much?
Okay.
Yes, I never sit at home, write songs for my own amusement, or I never have an idea of a song and decide I'm going to write that down as a song for some future reason. Obviously, life is affecting me all the time, so that it influences the songs, and but when it comes into actually belting them into shape, they come out of a royalty check, which will appear often maybe once every 3 or 4 years. Basically, that's how often the records come out, and there'll be a few $1,000s, and then I'll just go out and say I'm going to book a studio,
right?
And then I say I better think of some songs.
All right. Well, next week we're going to talk about your next solo album, Cry Against the Faith, and that's released in 1998. And so that means there's a 3-year gap there, which we will talk about next week. But right now we're going to go out with the title track from Midnight Rain, and that is, of course, Midnight Rain. Your comment on this track?
My comment was the actual inspiration for it was... Charlie couldn't think of a title for the album, and he co-wrote this song. He wrote the music, or the guitar patterns for it, and I wrote the melodies and the lyrics, and it was from a tattered old photograph. I've never taken a camera with me overseas, but someone sent me, and the photo had somehow stuck to another photo and separated. And there was a dear friend of mine from Greece, and in the rain, and this image coming out of this sort of this misty rain, and it was almost a sort of a romantic memory of Greece, and because it, once again, written in Australia, and even though they're in many ways collages of a multitude of events that the song, there's no one song about one person or one particular event. This was a collage of just a whole lot of very deep emotions that I felt towards Greece and many friends I had there.
Right. It's a good title. It can sort of conjure up all sorts of images for all sorts of people, I suppose. Midnight Rain.
Yes,
Yeah.
and Midnight Rain is often, one's fast asleep, but then the rain wakes one up. So when once again in the transient dream world, half awake, half asleep.
All right. Well, thank you once again, Lewis.
My
Lovely
pleasure,
to see
Irene.
you. Yeah. And next week, same time, same place.
Sure will be.
Okay, Lewis Tillett and this track, Midnight Rain, from the album Cry Against the Faith, released in 1998.
I see your face again, coming through the gentle rain. For me, it's a joy to see. In a while, I'll see your smile, high above in the clouded sky. Rain falls with a gentle sigh. I know you'll be here soon. At last your face appears. The rain falls like gladdened tears. Now I'm free, you're here with me. I knew things would be alright with the coming of the joyous night. It's true, I'm here with you. I knew you'd be here again. We'll meet in the light of the midnight rain. Now you're here, my deepest fears just seem to disappear. In the night I've seen the light. All my joy and pain is lost in the gentle rain. In your eyes I see the sky. I knew you'd be here again. We'll meet in the light of the midnight rain.
Lewis Tillett there from the album Midnight Rain. And very soon we'll be going to 2BOB raves, but just before we do, I'm going to play one more music track, and this is I Love It, and the track is It's Rock and Roll. 25 minutes to 1 o'clock. It's Midday Magazine with Irene B until 1:30 today, and you're on 2BOB Radio, your community radio station here in the Manning Valley.
In the world of rock and roll, there is no